The clocks in Berlin struck 4 in the morning on Monday, April 16th, 1945. To look at the city then was to look at a skeleton. The Allied bombing raids had already turned the Athens on the Spree into a landscape of jagged brick and hollowed-out cathedrals. But for the 3 million people still breathing inside its ruins, women, children, and old men, there was a fragile, terrifying sort of peace. The big blow hadn't happened yet. For weeks, the rumors had been the only currency left. They whispered in the U-Bahn stations used as air raid shelters. They whispered in the bread lines. The Russians are at the Oder. The Russians are 60 kilometers away. The Russians are coming. 60 kilometers. In a car, it is an hour's drive. For an army, it is a heartbeat. On the eastern bank of the Oder River, the air was cold and thick with the smell of damp earth and diesel fuel. Marshaled there was the largest concentration of military power the world had ever seen. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 41,000 mortars and guns, 6,000 tanks, 7,000 aircraft. They were not just an army, they were a vengeful tide, refined by 4 years of the most brutal warfare in human history. They had crawled from the ruins of Stalingrad, across the scorched earth of Ukraine, through the forests of Poland, and now they stood at the threshold. Their commander, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, stood at his observation post. He didn't look like a man about to win a war. He looked like a man about to settle a debt. He checked his watch. At precisely 5 o'clock, the world ended for the German Ninth Army dug into the Seelow Heights. It began with a roar that was felt before it was heard. 20,000 Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously. This wasn't the rhythmic pounding of traditional artillery. It was a wall of sound so dense it was described by survivors as a physical weight pressing against their chests. The vibrations traveled through the tectonic plates of Brandenburg, racing toward Berlin. In the city's heart, 6-year-old children were thrown from their beds. In the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, the dust shook from the ceiling onto Adolf Hitler's maps. This was the Stalin organ, the Katyusha rockets, screaming through the air like thousands of banshees. Then, Zhukov unleashed his psychological masterstroke. He didn't want to wait for the sun to rise. He wanted to bring a false, terrifying sun of his own. On his signal, 143 massive anti-aircraft searchlights were flipped on. They were positioned every 200 meters along the front. 100 billion candle power tore through the darkness, aimed directly at the German eyes on the ridge. The light hit the smoke of the artillery and the dust of the crumbling trenches, creating a hellish, milky fog. To the German soldiers, it looked as if the atmosphere itself had caught fire. They were blinded, pinned down in their foxholes by a light so bright it felt like it could peel the skin off their faces. Under the cover of this artificial day, the Red Army surged forward. The battle for Berlin had begun, but the gates to Berlin did not swing open easily. The Seelow Heights was a natural fortress, a steep ridge overlooking the marshy valley of the Oder. The German commander, General Gotthard Heinrici, was a master of defensive warfare. He had anticipated the barrage. Minutes before the Soviet guns fired, he had pulled his troops back from the front line into a second, hidden defensive position. The Soviet shells hit empty trenches. When the Red Army moved forward, they found themselves bogged down in the Hauptgraben canals and the thick spring mud of the valley. The searchlights, intended to aid the Soviets, backfired. The light reflected off the smoke, blinding the Soviet tank drivers instead of the Germans. From the heights above, The German 88mm guns began to bark. One by one, the Soviet T-34 tanks were turned into flaming iron coffins. For hours, the valley became a slaughterhouse. Zhukov, furious that his great offensive was stalling, ordered his reserve tank armies into the fray prematurely. It created a colossal traffic jam of steel and flesh. By noon on April 16th, the fields below Seelow were littered with the wreckage of hundreds of tanks and the bodies of thousands of men. But the sheer weight of the Soviet machine was undeniable. For every German gun, there were 10 Soviet ones. For every German soldier, there were 15 Russians. The ridge was being slowly, violently ground into dust. Back in Berlin, the midday sun was a pale, sickly disk obscured by the haze of the front. The sound of the guns was no longer a distant rumble. It was a constant, rhythmic thud that vibrated in the soles of people's feet. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, made one final, desperate push. The radio played heroic marches, interrupted by frantic announcements. The Bolshevik hordes will be broken at the gates. Every house is a fortress. Every window is a gun port. But the people knew. They watched as the Volkssturm, the People's Storm, marched to the outskirts. These were not the elite SS divisions of 1940. These were 60-year-old postmen in oversized helmets and 12-year-old Hitler Youth boys with Panzerfausts strapped to their bicycles. They looked like ghosts marching toward a bonfire. Panic began to take root. Those with cars tried to flee to the west, toward the Americans, but the roads were choked with military columns and rubble. The SS began roaming the streets, looking for deserters. Anyone found without orders, anyone who looked too scared or too tired, was dragged to the nearest lamppost. On April 16th, the city's trees and balconies began to bear a gruesome fruit. Soldiers and civilians hanged with signs around their necks that read, "I was a coward and refused to defend my Führer." The city was trapped between two terrors, the vengeful army coming from the east and the dying regime strangling its own people from within. As evening fell on the 16th, the true scale of the catastrophe became visible. The sky to the east was a deep, bruised purple, pulsing with the orange flashes of the continuing bombardment. Berliners retreated into the deep. The city's U-Bahn tunnels and the massive flak towers, giant concrete fortresses, became the only world that mattered. In the Anhalter station, thousands of families huddled on the tracks. There was no running water. The air was a thick soup of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of fear. Mothers sat in silence, clutching their children, listening to the ceiling groan. Every time a heavy shell landed nearby, the lights would flicker and sand would pour from the cracks in the concrete. They knew that 60 kilometers had become 50. 50 would become 40. Above them, the night witches, Soviet female pilots in wood and canvas biplanes, cut their engines and glided silently over the city, dropping small, harassing bombs that whistled through the ruins. There was no sleep to be had. By the late hours of April 16th, the German Ninth Army at Seelow was beginning to fracture. They had held the ridge for a day, an unthinkable feat given the odds, but they were running out of shells. The tanks had no fuel. The soldiers hadn't slept in 48 hours. Zhukov's pressure was relentless. He was under direct orders from Stalin to take the city before the Americans could reach it. He didn't care about the cost in human life. He threw wave after wave of infantry into the gap. As the sun went down, the first Soviet breakthroughs occurred. The gates to Berlin were cracked. The German lines were no longer a solid wall. They were a series of isolated islands of resistance surrounded and bypassed by the Soviet tide. The road to the Reichstag was now open. History often looks at the fall of Berlin as a single moment, the flag over the Reichstag or the pistol shot in the Führer bunker. But the fate of the city was sealed on April 16th. It was the day the mask of the 1,000-year Reich was finally ripped away to reveal the ruin beneath. It was the day the civilian population realized that no miracle weapons were coming to save them. It was the day the geography of Europe changed forever. As the midnight hour passed, heading into the 17th, the fire in the east grew brighter. The Soviet tanks were refueled and moving again. The infantry was marching. In the center of Berlin, near the Brandenburg Gate, a lone sentry might have looked out toward the horizon. He wouldn't have seen a city anymore. He would have seen a graveyard waiting to be filled. The Battle of Berlin would last another 16 days. There would be more blood, more fire, and more rubble. But the beginning of the end happened here, on this Monday, in the mud of Seelow and the trembling basements of the capital. April 16th, 1945. The day the world came to Berlin to end the war it had started.